Railroad engineers, have you ever come across anything creepy or weird on the tracks while driving your train? Edit. Wow, definitely did not expect this thread to take off like it did. Thank you to everyone who responded. Looking forward to reading the rest of your responses in the morning. Edit 2. After reading a lot of your responses, I have a whole new respect for train engineers and conductors and what you guys do. It's amazing what some of you have experienced. Not an engineer, but I do operate a high-rail truck with train wheels on it that zips down the railroad tracks. I was working in the port of Metro Vancouver and had to measure out 2,500 feet from where we were working to do a certain regulatory test, so I jumped in my truck and reset my counter and went on my way. I arrived at my 2,500-foot stop and jumped out to spray paint the railroad tie to mark that spot for the rest of the crew. I then realized I had no spray paint, nothing in the whole truck. I searched for a little flag I could put up, but had none of those either. I ended up searching the ground for something like a stick or garbage that I could just leave there in the middle of the tracks for the time being. Now, down in the part of Vancouver, the tracks basically run parallel to Hastings Street, and for those of you who have never heard of it, it's basically the world's biggest confined heroin problem. Drugs Incorporated actually did their heroin episode down there. Anyway, you always find crazy shit along the tracks there. If it's not a body, it's 500 hypodermic needles. So in this giant pile of garbage, I find an old BBQ, complete with a set of BBQ tools like tongs and brush, etc. I thought it would be pretty funny if I just set up a BBQ in the middle of the tracks. We were working there, so no chance of a train hitting it, so I went to move the BBQ and found, no joke, the biggest, longest, girthiest dildo I have ever seen in my life, even to this day. It was at least 3 feet long and had to have been almost a foot in circumference. Who is buying this type of thing? I decided this would be the best thing to mark the location with. I ended up finding a couple old random shoes in that pile, and, armed with my tongs I found earlier and a pair of gloves, I managed to jam the dildo, balls first obviously, into one of the shoes and got it to stand upright all by itself. I really wish I was able to have my phone at work. I would have had a good picture for you guys. Anyway, with that spot marked for the next guy, I put my truck into reverse and headed back to the crossing we were working at. I arrived and the foreman at the time was asking how I marked the footage without taking the paint. I told him that he would eventually find out when we got there. We packed everything up and were waiting for a train on the opposite track to go by us when the train's brakes hammered on and started screeching. Scared the shit out of all of us. Now when a train goes into emergency, everything stops and the traffic controller is on the radio immediately. We were all told to stay where we were as there had been a person struck by a train just half a mile from our job site. We took our truck off the tracks and headed down the parallel road to see what had happened. When we arrived, we found a CP police officer and 3 Port Authority vehicles there, all parked right beside where I had left my marker. With the way that it had looked, how thick it was, and the fact that the top of it was red, I guess one of the Port Authority officers thought it was a severed leg and called it in to stop all trains in the area and call the police force as well. The look on my foreman's face was priceless when he looked back at me after looking at the 4 grown men standing around a 3-foot-high dildo stuffed into a dirty Reebok. We didn't say a word to anybody about it, as I'm sure we would all be in shit. I realize now that this is probably not the response you were looking for, and I'm almost certain you had to be there to really appreciate how ridiculous this was, but, you know what, this is all you're getting from me. I hauled half a dead bear off the tracks on my second day working for this company. I've also seen a few dead bodies of people committing suicide by train, but they're just laying in the ditch. They didn't ever end up exploding like I thought they would. Edit change diameter to circumference. I worked on the signaling for the light rail system in Pittsburgh, USA. We would do all of our testing late at night after revenue hours. Lots of wildlife around the tracks. As we were moving along at about 50 miles per hour, a white-tailed deer jumps out onto the tracks and we clobber the poor thing. The engineer doesn't hesitate, gets on the radio and tells Central Control to call Hannibal Lecter and gives the millipist. I look at him sideways but he doesn't explain. We continue our run into the city, turn around, and head back out the same way. As we come up on the site where we hit the deer, there is a guy in full camouflage on the side of the railroad butchering the carcass, with a big pile of steaming deer guts next to the track, Did I mention it was about 15 degrees Fahrenheit and snowing? Engineer gives a toot on the horn and we continue with our run. Accidental deer death, it would have been criminal to let the meat go to waste. Also, it came pre-tenderized. I work in Houston as an engineer, and we usually putt around town between 10 to 20 miles per hour. Slow enough for a naked crackhead to jump out of a bush by a city park and start pleasuring herself in front of the engine. I guess she really likes trains. Edit. I also had a kid play chicken with my train when I was going about 50 miles per hour, but that was more scary than weird. I haven't hit anybody yet, but everybody says it's only a matter of time. The thing about playing chicken is that both parties have to be opposed to colliding. Trains don't really get that part. Ruins the fun, to be honest. Not if you enjoy the feel of warm, red mist on your face. Freight train conductor here, wanna know what's creepy or weird? When people try to get across the tracks last second or play chicken with my 30 million pound train. You're not playing chicken with an inanimate object, you're playing with me and my engineer. When you lose, and it happened far too often, I get to see your exploded carcass flipping at 150 RPMs off the track and deal with the overwhelming feeling of guilt. Please don't ride a beat a train. Edit. A few words. People do this stuff with fire apparatus too. We will be on the road going to a call. People will have all day to go or wait until the big red fricking truck with the flashing blinks and woo-woos passes. No, they decide it's best to cross or turn 3 seconds before the truck gets to their spot. One time I went skinny dipping with some friends, then we all stood next to the track naked as a train went by. Hopefully it brightened the engineer's day. Depends on what gender you are, I'm sure. Since we are on Reddit, it was most likely a group of slightly overweight shaggy dudes. AKA, just what the doctor ordered. Dad's of RR guy in a bigger city yard. He's seen so much death, so much death. Mostly suicides, people jumping in front of trains or laying down on the tracks. He says if you don't lay the right way it can actually take you a few minutes to die because the weight of the cars seals off anything broken. So even if you're ripped in half it takes a few minutes to bleed out. TLDR, unless you really want to die horribly and slowly, don't lay on the tracks to die. Jump in front of the train. Or get fucking help and don't traumatize the people who end up killing up you. No, really get help. USA National Suicide Prevention Lifeline 1-800-273-TALK-8255. Edit. Formatting. This is the highest voted thing I have ever gotten on Reddit, and of course it's on my sexy account. Thanks guys, and really, if you feel suicidal, get help. You owe it to yourself. A large part of my family works for the railroad, and here is what I've heard, not all creepy but scary. 1. My dad, who is a no-nonsense 6'6" man, came home one night after a derailment and was white as a sheet. He told my mom he met a man walking away from the derailment, which was in the middle of the woods. He didn't think it was too weird because some people check out wrecks and derailments. Anyway, my dad gets to the derailment and says hey to my uncle. The cause of the derailment was a truck that had been hit and then pushed by the engine. Now, none of this is weird until my dad sees the man in the truck. It looked like a beat-up version of the man he met on the way to the derailment. He got the man's driver's license when the sheriff's deputy showed up. The way my uncle put it was your dad almost passed out and had to sit down. He didn't say why because you don't do that around railroad men. 2. My uncle was walking the rails, which you do to prevent derailments and such, and he had to pee. So he went into some woods. He said he walked up onto what he was sure was some kind of animal sacrifice weird shit. He called the other workers to see it, and they were very creeped out. They just left and tried to make a joke of it. 3. The number of drunk hobos, homeless people who pass out on the rails is oddly high. 4. Also, a hobo was found dead in a hooper car, the kind that are open and typically hold grain. They figured since it was the summer he wanted more air circulation and hopped in that one. Well, the car was filled and no one really looks in it. It wasn't figured out until the car was unloaded. Locomotive engineer from the Northeast US here with 15 years service. Aside from the dead animals, I think finding a body that was hit by a previous train might have been the creepiest. I've hit a few cars and people before, but I never had to go back and look. That's the conductor's job. The person we found wasn't really identifiable as a human being, just a pile of meat. What gave it away were the scraps of clothing mixed into the pile. As far as weird things, there are a few people out there that are really in love with trains. You can use your imagination as to what these grown men do in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. I know I am not supposed to ask, apparently according to what I have already read in this thread, but my imagination isn't conjuring up anything that I could possibly consider doing at 2 a.m. near a train. Other than happening to be somewhere at 2 a.m. when a train drives by. I'm a conductor, so I'm the guy that sits directly to the left of the engineer. I haven't been doing it for too long yet, so I probably haven't seen the amount of stuff a qualified engineer has. My first week as a trainee on the job, we came across a dead pony next to the tracks that must have been hit only a few hours earlier. The next morning, going back the other way, we passed by it again, and it looked like what you would expect to see on a Discovery Channel show. Scavengers had gotten to it that night, and it was maybe half a pony at this point. Nature is pretty rad. The death of the Pony Express was a sad but necessary development in the history of both travel and technology. Like, comment, and share. Reddit Story Topper. Subscribe now.